Good morning, everyone. I'm Deandra Glover Thomas, Program Coordinator for the Kentucky Autism Training Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, My Child Has Autism, Now What? Recommendations for Parents, which will be presented by Michelle Antle, who is a field trainer here at KATC. Feel free to ask questions or make comments at any point throughout the presentation by typing your question in the question box and clicking send. If you cannot see the question box, click on the orange box with the white arrow in the upper right corner of your screen to open the question box area, and Michelle will be answering all questions at the end of the presentation today. Michelle Antle completed her undergraduate degree at Kentucky Wesleyan College in Owensboro, Kentucky, and her Ed.S. degree in the field of school psychology. In 2011, Michelle was named Kentucky School Psychologist of the Year. She has worked as a school psychologist in public schools for 11 years and also has experience in the mental health field through serving as an autism coordinator for Family Options, Inc. and working with children and families through the Impact Plus program. In her current role at KATC, Michelle provides direct training and technical assistance to education staff, social and community personnel, counselors, job coaches, and families. And without further ado, I'd like to switch up my screen over to today's presenter, Michelle Antle. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good.
All right, I am switching over to you now.
All right.
All right,
Good morning, everyone.
Okay, I can see your screen.
Okay, is it okay? Can you see the whole screen?
I can.
All right. Well, the mission of the Autism Training Center is kind of well-rounded in that we really just want to strengthen our state system support for anybody that's affected with an autism spectrum disorder. So KATC offers many different types of services, and so I really wanted to start out by kind of telling you about some free resources that we offer here at the center. We have an autism listserv that I would encourage you to be a part of. There are frequent emails that go out about trainings that are offered throughout the state, as well as other resources or maybe even research projects that are going on in the state that you could opt in to participate in. We also have a pretty informative website, so you can find out anything from who our staff is and what our backgrounds are to information about evidence-based practices and where you can go for additional resources. We also have a resource library in which that if there is something that you wanted to learn more about, let's say you want to know more about social stories, but you didn't want to buy a book about it, you could contact Dee, and she would be happy to set you up with and let you know what resources we have available, on that particular topic, and she will mail that to you. And then we just ask that you mail that back in a timely fashion so that others can benefit from that resource as well. We also have a services and supports directory on our website. It's kind of difficult to keep that updated at the pace that providers change and add and have additional services provided or pick up additional insurance companies, but we try to keep that as up to date and as current as possible. But we also encourage you that if you need supports within your region to contact one of the field training coordinators that's responsible for that region, and we would be more than happy to get you in touch with additional providers and resources. There's also the Autism Internet modules, and I'm going to give you that website a little bit later in the presentation, but you could even Google Autism Internet modules. You just go online and create a login, and it's free of charge. They don't blast you with emails or things like that to your inbox. I think maybe I've only gotten 1 or 2 emails from them in the 4 or 5 years that I've now been on their website. And with Autism Internet modules, you can go on and you could click what environment you're from, or what you're wanting interventions from. So it might be in the home, in the school, in the community, and it gives a whole list of modules that you could click on and watch. And they're pretty in-depth modules on the background and the basics and the evidence that support that particular practice, as well as show you videos and things like that that you can access as well. Those are all free of charge, and you can watch them as many times as possible or as you'd like. And so the great thing that I like about it is you can start it and stop it as frequently as you need to, and we all are really busy and have a lot of interruptions sometimes in our day, so that makes it really good. There's a lot of parent support groups that are utilizing the Autism Internet modules, and they're watching these modules as a group so that they can learn more and have a lot of discussion about their child and how that might be able to be implemented. So that's another great resource for you. We at the center also offer regional workshops. This year our regional workshops were on communication and socialization and teaching those social skills. So we offer those throughout, usually at the state parks. So you can, all of those are completed for this year, but in the future definitely look to our website for additional training opportunities. We also offer a variety of professional development workshops for a variety of different people. So we've trained doctors' offices, dentists' offices, community partners such as police, fire, people like that. So we also train a lot of family support groups. We participate in a lot of conferences and present on different topics and give additional resources to providers through that way as well. We also partner with the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. You can Google that, and there's a ton of information on their website as well about evidence-based practices, and they have some new additional resources that they've just added this past summer. So we also have a listing of family support groups that might be close to your area. So I would encourage you to look through that on our website as well, or you can contact Heidi Cooley-Cook, who is responsible for our family network. She's our family coordinator. So you can definitely get with her on contacts for people and meeting dates and times and that kind of thing. We also partner very closely with the special education cooperatives, which are throughout the state. I believe there's 9 different educational cooperatives, and we partner with their low incidence consultants or people that are also providing technical assistance to the schools, and that really helps to network educators with other outside agencies as well, such as mental health providers, speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, other hospitals that might be offering intervention services as well as assessments. So today I want to get a little background about autism just to give you more information. You can find more information from the Center for Disease Control, but here are just a few statistics. According to the last study that was conducted in March of 2014, the number is now estimated that 1 in every 68 children have a diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder. That's a 30% increase since 2008, which was the last time that the Center for Disease Control conducted their large study. So that means that over 2 million Americans are living with an autism spectrum disorder. And when you look at the costs that are associated with autism, 60% of those costs, they say, are in adult services. So we know that it's really important for early diagnosis and early intervention, because we know that we can reduce that by even 2/3 if we can get in there and provide early intervention, get them the services that they need so that they can acquire the skills that they need in order to be successful in life. So what is autism? We know that it's a complex neurological disorder that affects socialization skills and communication skills specifically. And typically we also see restricted, repetitive, or stereotype behaviors, which can look a little bit differently, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. The important thing to remember is that if you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism. Because it's a spectrum disorder, different students can even physically have some of the same characteristics and behaviors, but have very different educational and social emotional needs. So the way that you might deal or help one individual with autism may look completely and totally different for another student that looks very similar. So it's just important to keep in mind. And that's something that when we're in the educational setting we hear a lot, is that we have a teacher that says, oh, well, I've had a student with autism in my class before, so I do have experience, and then they get this new student and they're like, oh, this is not anything like I had experienced before, and I'm going to need some further assistance. So we hear the same things from pediatricians as well. So I think it's really important to kind of keep that in the back of your head just in planning for interventions and different avenues. There currently is no quote-unquote cure for autism. The word cure is very questionable in the autism community. There are many research-based studies that are out there that do indicate that with the use of evidence-based practices that behavioral characteristics can diminish or greatly improve because we're targeting those areas and giving them skills and tools in order to improve their skills in those areas, and so they become more fully functioning individuals. So it's important that you kind of keep that in the back of your head. A neurological disorder is very difficult to change or undo, if you will, but we can create new pathways and teach them different skills just as we would teach any other student. I think it's really important. Sometimes when we get that autism diagnosis, everyone jumps immediately to all the negative things or the things that kids can't do. And I think that sometimes it's really important to kind of take a step back and look at what are the skills that they do exhibit and really focus in on their strengths. Because one of the ways that we know that we can reach individuals with autism is to use them and use what their interests are in order to teach them a variety of new skills. And sometimes we have to know what they're good at in order to know what we need to teach and how we might be able to teach that in a more effective way. So one of the things that I would always say about many of the individuals that I've worked with is that they're very smart in an out-of-the-box kind of way. They think about and analyze problems from a different angle than you or I might even think about in the very beginning. And sometimes, especially if that individual is not very verbal, it's difficult for us to kind of see their out-of-the-box kind of thinking. But as they grow and develop, the ideas that they have and just the perspectives that they take are really unique and afford us an opportunity if we that interact with them have the opportunity to stop and kind of see things through their perspective. Many of them are very creative in the way that they think and deal with issues. I think that sometimes they don't have the skills in order to be able to cope through a specific situation, so they have to be creative in order to be able to think about how they can communicate or function in a way that you or I might not think about. We also sometimes see that they have strong rote memory skills because they have a high drive for wanting to have sameness and not have a change in their routine, and they don't like that transition. Anything that we consider to be rote skills or concrete skills, they enjoy those types of things. So anytime that they have the opportunity to have or use those rote kinds of skills that they have, I think that that gives them an opportunity to feel a little bit more in control of their world, and I think we should capitalize on that. Also very affectionate and loving, and sometimes that can look very different in a different light, especially than if you're raising a child that does not have autism. So it may take them a while to come around, and they may not show you love in the traditional way of wanting to give you hugs and kisses and tell you that they love you, but they show you that they love you in a different way. And I've been very blessed to have many individuals that I've worked with in my life, and I always say that they all have a unique way of showing love to those people that they enjoy being around, and I've been blessed to have those opportunities. And kind of like I've already said, they definitely see the world in a different way. And I think in this time and age, in this day in society, we really need those kind of people because we need that out-of-the-box thinking to get us to have a different type of problem solving to get us to the next level in life. So I really think it's important that we hone in on these strengths in order to be able to deal with their weaknesses or areas of deficit. So some of the areas that we typically look at targeting for intervention in which they may not have strong skills in are communication, and that can be not only the way that they verbally express themselves, but it's also understanding the way that people non-verbally communicate. So maybe it's that, personal space is difficult for them to understand, and the importance of the roles that play in learning to be able to read social cues, which lead us to other socialization skills. And a lot of times those areas need to be targeted for intervention and formally taught as well. Maybe it's that we need to teach them to read the nonverbal cues of others so that they can adjust their behavior accordingly to be able to carry on a conversation. or even be able to sustain a conversation for a topic that maybe they're not interested in, but we know that that's all a mandatory part of kind of our daily living when we interact socially with other people. Also, we need to focus on adaptive skills, meaning that what types of skills do they need in order to be independent in their daily living? So maybe it's that they need to be able to learn to brush their teeth. Maybe it's that we need to teach them how to cook a small meal, in a microwave by themselves in order to be able to, have them have the ability to live independently later on in life. Maybe it's that we need to teach them about money skills and time management, how to write a check, how to balance a bank account, where do you even go in the community for certain services. Maybe it's that, you teach them that if you're sick, you have to go to the doctor, or a hospital would be a place that you could access services if you're really, really sick. Or to know that you can go to a police officer and ask for help if you become lost or separated from your parents. So sometimes those adaptive skills are not formally thought that we need to teach those things, but especially with our individuals with autism, we need to be planning for the future and seeing what types of things that they're going to need assistance with, because as we talked about earlier, that early intervention is so incredibly important, especially in the planning of those independent skills that they're going to need to make them successful throughout life. And also we talk about executive functioning skills, and people say, well, what is that? That's kind of your ability to take in and store information and then retrieve it when you need it. And that's kind of a really simplistic definition, but in general, if you think about your mind as being a file room, and so if I come to you and I say, tell me some colors, you know in that file room that you can go to that particular filing cabinet, and in this drawer you're going to open it up and you're going to be able to see in a nice sequential order the information that you need: red, green, yellow, blue, orange, etc. And for many of our kids, their file rooms are organized differently. And so sometimes it may take them extra time and assistance in order to find that information. The information is likely in there somewhere, but it's just getting them to understand where to go in order to find that information. So it's getting them to understand how their file room is organized and help them to be able to find that in a quick, time-efficient manner, so that they can give that information out to someone else and not be distracted by other files that they might see laying around in that room. That's kind of a very general, simplistic kind of idea in the way that I've explained that to you. But in general, just thinking about how you take in and store and retrieve information and how you can communicate that information to other people. The other thing that we often don't think about is generalization of all the skills that an individual is learning. Sometimes our students with autism can learn a particular skill with a particular person, but then have trouble generalizing or using that or performing that skill with someone else or in a different environment. So it may be that they understand how to brush their teeth in that home setting, but then if they were to go and stay the night at a friend's, then they would have no earthly idea that those same set of steps that I go through are the same steps that I do at home. It's just that sometimes the environment or the people that might be involved kind of throw them off a little bit, and so we need to formally teach them those skills in all of the environments that they're in. So it can even be that, I've worked with individuals in the home where, the parent and I worked with this particular child on learning, basic measurement types of things, like in the kitchen when they're learning to make recipes. And then they go to school, and in the school setting, the teacher is working on some of those same independent living things, and the teacher says, well, this child has never been able to exhibit to me that they have an understanding of how to use a measuring cup. So we take video of them doing it at home, and the teacher's like, wow, that's not anything that we've seen in the past, or what we see in our setting. And that doesn't mean that that student doesn't have that skill or have that set of skills mastered. It just means that we need to work on formally teaching them that that's the way that you're supposed to do it in a variety of settings with a variety of people. And sometimes we don't think about the importance of having that formally taught to make sure that that really does lead them to further independence. The other question that we get a lot at the center are about diagnosis criteria. And a few years ago, the the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the manual that professionals use to look at criteria for diagnoses such as autism, has changed. And so we went from the 4th revision to the 5th revision. And there were a lot of conversations that took place in the professional community and a lot of research that went into looking at what criteria should be listed in that new 5th edition of that criteria. And a lot of parents were kind of struggling with what that looked like. The biggest change before, within the 4th revision, there were things such as Asperger's syndrome, what they consider to be pervasive developmental delay not otherwise specified, which just is a fancy word for saying that they had some characteristics of autism but not enough in order to receive a full diagnosis of autism. There were other things such as child disintegrative disorder, which was a way of looking at saying that a child had skills but then they regressed. There was a lot more to it than that, but in general that was the gist. And so then they really started to, there was a lot of conversation in the community because they were trying to decide, well, how do you say that a child is high-functioning autism versus having Asperger's syndrome? How would you go about doing that? And really and truly what the professionals finally decided was that it doesn't matter what you call it because it's still all on the autism spectrum. And so therefore that doesn't matter what it's called. It's more about addressing those issues that are present for that particular individual. So in general, they decided that they were going to get rid of all of the subcategories and fold them into more of a broad terminology, which they called autism spectrum disorders. Now, the questions that we used to get were things like, well, my child had previously been diagnosed with Asperger's, so does that mean that my child no longer has Asperger's anymore? And the answer is no. It just means that now they're still considered to be on the autism spectrum. So when you read online or you have materials that might come to you from your pediatrician or other credible resources, you may still see some of these quote-unquote old language, such as Asperger's and things like that. And I think that that really is important to kind of understand as you read through, just knowing that, it's not that all of that necessarily went away, it's just now folded into one larger term. So the other criteria, and I'm not going to go into grave detail about these things, but I do want you to understand about the characteristics that actually comprise the diagnosis, because those characteristics are what it is that we need to target for intervention. So when we think about planning for our individuals and what types of intervention services we need to tap into, it's really important that we understand the deficits that we have, that a child might have in these areas. So typically now, the first criteria says that individuals have a deficit in social communication as well as social interaction. So that's across multiple contexts, and they have to have all of the 3 following categories. The first thing is deficits in social and emotional reciprocity, which means that give and take of relationships. So yes, it means that I'm going to look at you and you're going to start a conversation, and that I understand that I need to respond back to you. So the give and take kind of conversations and behavior. The second criteria is deficits in nonverbal communicative behavior involved in social interaction. So things like if I'm looking at my watch constantly when I'm having a conversation with you, then to the layperson that means that, hey, she needs to be somewhere else, and so I need to end this conversation or pick it up at a different time or kind of wrap up what it is that I want to say. So understanding that we read those nonverbal behaviors of others and then adjust our behavior accordingly. Sometimes that's difficult. Also reading things such as tone of voice, the volume that you have with your voice, and the cadence of your speech, which is just the speed in which you speak as well. And then the last criteria under this umbrella would be deficits in developing new friendships and then also maintaining those relationships. So sometimes at an early age especially, it's okay and you don't necessarily see sometimes a lot of those deficits, especially with our higher functioning individuals, with developing those friendships and playing together, you know, even with parallel play or tolerating that, but it comes more as they start to acquire more in-depth social skills that might be required in maintaining friendships, such as not always talking about their perseverative area of interest or only things that interest that particular individual. And sometimes also understanding those relationships. So understanding the give and take of relationships, understanding that, you know, why someone might be upset at a funeral or why someone might be excited when their team won a ball game. So these are all things that can present very differently in different individuals, but generally these deficits are going to occur in some type of capacity in all of our individuals that receive a diagnosis. Now, in the past, communication and socialization were actually seen as two separate criteria, and now they understand that that relationship is so close that social and communication should actually go together, and so they have all of that kind of lumped under this one larger area of criteria. The second criteria that must be met are what we call restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, or maybe activities that they need to do over and over or in a certain way. And you have to have at least two of the four that are mentioned here. The first one is more of your stereotyped or repetitive motor movements that many people think of when they think of children or individuals with autism. So it might be hand flapping or toe walking or what we call self-stimulatory behavior. It might be that there's certain speech patterns that they repeat constantly, whether that be a certain word or phrase or a particular sound that they make repetitively for the purpose of just enjoying that repetitive movement. The second bullet there is insistence on sameness. They don't like change. They don't like to be surprised. So they're very inflexible or have difficulty with accepting that change as it comes about. The third pattern there, or the third bullet, is having highly restricted or fixated interests. And we all know that many of our students, especially at a young age, find things that they're really interested in. So, you know, as a 3 or a 4-year-old, maybe it's that they're very interested in dinosaurs or Thomas the Tank Engine or Superman or Batman, and they might have a definite fixated interest. But the way that this differs is that these children typically have an abnormal intensity or focus. So, for example, instead of just knowing that dinosaurs and enjoying dinosaurs, the way that it would be abnormal in intensity and focus is that they could give you the Latin name and tell you what prehistoric period that particular dinosaur came from and what was the genus or the species name. And that seems kind of odd that we even think about that, but that's kind of, in my mind, how we would differentiate between what is a typical pattern of being interested or fixated on something versus having that abnormal level of intensity or focus. You know, it would not be typical for a 3 or a 4-year-old to come up and give you that detailed information, you know, about a dinosaur. So things like that. And the fourth bullet is definitely something that has always been present in our individuals with autism, but in the fifth revision of the DSM, they really finally acknowledged it, and that is the differences that they have in their sensory input or the way that they process the sensory aspects of their environment. So it's sensitive to those things, so they have a heightened sense of alertness when it comes to sounds that might be present or smells that might be in their environment or touch, that they respond in a negative way to some of those, or that it's overly so for them. Or it could be the other way, in which they have a hypo-reactivity to that, meaning that, you know, they could put their hand on a hot burner and not have the sensations to go, oh gosh, this is burning my hand and I need to move that away. So sometimes I had a student that I worked with a long time ago with a family, and he had fallen off the couch, and it was a pretty big fall, and he never cried or anything like that. And a couple days later, his mom noticed that his arm was swelling, and come to find out his arm was broken. And she said, I feel horrible that I didn't know, but he never cried, he never complained. You know, only when the swelling came up did she realize that she needed to get medical attention. So she just didn't understand how he could have had a broken arm and never cried or lost sleep or anything like that. But I think it really has to do with the way that our sensory systems perceive different things in our environment. So again, 2 of the 4 listed there would have to be met in order for that criteria to be met. The other thing that I wanted to talk briefly about, because we get a lot of questions about this at the center as well, is that the DSM is used in the medical and mental health worlds to give the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders, but that the State Department of Education has a different set of eligibility guidelines. And that's really difficult sometimes for parents to understand because autism should be autism. However, I wanted to present you with the eligibility guidelines that the State Department of Education has for autism in this state. The first criteria that's listed there under those Kentucky education guidelines are that they have a developmental disability that affect their verbal or nonverbal communication skills. So therefore it kind of clusters the verbal and nonverbal and socialization aspects of things that we talked about kind of under that letter A few minutes ago. The second criteria there again, that it affects the social interaction skills in some way in the educational setting. The other criteria is primarily the result of an emotional or behavioral disability, meaning that it's not because they have difficulty with, let's say, I don't know, regulating their emotions. It's not just due to just that there are other characteristics that would be present. And the most important thing is that fourth bullet, and you can see that I've bolded and underlined, and that's that the evaluation information that's conducted by the school or presented to the school have to confirm what they call an adverse impact on their educational performance, which means that it's not enough just to have a child that has a diagnosis of autism, but that in some way it has to be negatively impacting them in the educational setting in order for them to receive services. And when I say services, that typically means that a specialist or an educational person who has been excessively trained in disabilities would be targeting or providing intervention for your student in the school setting and would develop what's called an individualized education plan, or otherwise known as an IEP that you may have heard about. So sometimes when a child is young, it may be that their adverse educational impact may be minimal, and then as they go through the educational setting, we hope not, but sometimes that adverse impact actually grows. And it could be that their impact is more social in the way that they're able to function in a classroom. Maybe that they can read and write and do math on, you know, an age-appropriate level, but just struggle because they have trouble with maintaining and even being in an educational environment and all of the hyperstimuli or you know, sensory input or the social relationships that might be involved in that educational setting that they would be required to deal with on a daily basis. And the last two things there, just have to say that there's not, you know, their issues that they're having in the classroom are not due to a lack of instruction. So it's not that they've missed out on that instruction or that they've, you know, been absent. Your child can't be absent a ton. Otherwise, their deficits could be due to the fact that they've not received direct instruction. And then the last thing looks at English proficiency, because we know that with language deficits, if we're speaking in a different language, then their language deficits may be the reason why that they are having trouble in the classroom. So just want to make sure that, you know, their English, if they're a non-English speaking family, is not the reason why they're struggling through that. But again, if I had anything to take home here, I would definitely, and you see that I've bolded and underlined, the adverse educational impact. It's not just enough to have a diagnosis. Diagnosis does not equal an eligibility under the guidelines by the Kentucky Department of Education. So where do we go from here? How do I choose interventions for my child? What are some evidence-based interventions? And what are some other considerations for families? So the first thing, when we start looking at interventions, this is where you're going to have to get very child-specific. You're going to need to answer some general questions, like what are my child's interests? You know, what are they definitely interested in? Because if we're not going to be able to tap into things that they're interested in, they're probably not going to be too open-minded in hearing what it is that we have to teach them or what we have to say. Also, what are my child's strengths? What are they really, really good at? And also, what are their weaknesses? You know, maybe some of them have more deficits in receptive and expressive communication, so how they understand and give verbiage out in order to communicate their knowledge to someone. So really kind of thinking and honing in on what is it that seems to be their primary area of weakness. And also, what is doable for my family? Many of us are working families, working parents that also have to figure out how we're going to fit in intervention for our child. And sometimes it's very overwhelming because we have parents that say, well, where do I even start? You know, like there's no way that I can cram in, 10 hours a week of one-on-one intervention in addition to the school day, things like that. So you've got to figure out, what's going to be doable for my family. And by looking at their strengths and weaknesses, that's also going to have provide an insight to you to be able to say, okay, this is where I probably need to spend more time thinking about, what are the priorities? Do we need to focus in on socialization, or do we really need to focus in on that communication piece? And then also, do I have the resources to provide this intervention? Where do I go to get those resources? And a lot of times those are the calls that we get at the center, and we welcome those because we know that it's difficult for parents, especially when they've first gotten the diagnosis, to know about what resources might be in their community. And many of the times it might be that you as parents can provide the intervention that they need, but you just need that guidance from that outside provider to say, okay, this would be how you do this and how you work on this on a daily basis. Because what we find time and time again, and it's difficult to understand, is that even though we might take our kid to speech language therapy or occupational therapy, that really and truly that 1 hour or 2 hours a week that they might get that intervention is not near enough, because we have to live it on a daily basis. So we as parents have to reinforce all of those things that they might be learning in therapy so that they learn to generalize that across people and across environments. And they have to practice those skills every day in order for those interventions to be effective. And the big question there at the bottom is this intervention supported by the research? There are so many intervention strategies out there, and that's not to say that they may not be a good fit for your child, but I do think that you can get very overwhelmed by the number of interventions that people may offer you. So really taking time to step back and look and say, well, what does the research actually show when it comes to our students? This is a visual that myself and several of the other co-op members that I work with actually came up with. And if you will look here at the top, you can see that these are the 3 areas that we've talked about this morning that would be required for having an autism spectrum disorder. So communication, socialization, and restrictive or repetitive areas of interest. And as you can see, we have tried to come up with a visual strategy for each of these areas because many of us in our adult lives are visual learners. So when we see this particular icon, it might help us to remember, oh yeah, that's the communication part, or oh yes, this is about socialization. So we tried to come up with a visual image paired with the areas that might be impacted with our students with autism. So obviously we have areas of cognition that might be impacted as well. So how they store and retrieve information, kind of what we talked about, as well as how much time is needed in order to process that information. We also talked about, under that restrictive or repetitive areas of interest, that there might be a sensory component to their characteristics that we might see. So whether that be touch or seeing or vocalizations or hearing, that's important to consider. And then here we have academics. So how does that impact them in the educational setting? It might be that they have a great rote memory for remembering, math skills. 2 + 2 always equals 4, no matter what. But they have difficulty when it comes to comprehending or understanding what it is that they're reading. And this middle area here, emotional vulnerability, I think that that's important because we need to think about, the role that anxiety would play when you don't know what's going to happen in your environment and how to deal with that. And you know that you might not have those socialization skills, then you become overly anxious and maybe not know how to deal with your emotions effectively. And then the last area was what we consider to be motor skills. So in order for you to kind of have a summary of each of these things that we've talked about, on the next slide there, we've kind of taken this and I took it and kind of made some general kinds of things that you might see under each of these categories. So communication, socialization, restricted area, you can see that it matches up with the previous slide. and the visual images that go with it. I would consider printing out these 2 slides as a front and back kind of thing, and keeping, maybe even laminating that, or keeping a record and going through each of these domains and kind of circling the things that you feel like, maybe in red you might want to circle the things that are difficult for your child, and with a green marker or a yellow highlighter you might want to highlight the things that your child is extremely good at. Because one of the things that we see is it's, again, very easily to be overwhelmed with, where do I start and what types of interventions should I focus on? So by taking this and kind of highlighting those areas of strengths and weaknesses, you can kind of see visually, well, gosh, we have a lot of red things that are circled over here in this area, but maybe not so much up here. So if that's the case, you have a lot of strengths here and you have a lot of weaknesses here, then that would tell you, well, maybe I should spend a lot of my time focusing on this emotional vulnerability part, and maybe we can utilize things that they're good at up here to address some of these weaknesses here. So this is just kind of a formal way to kind of organize maybe your thoughts and ideas. And this, by all means, is not an exhaustive list. This is not, a perfect rendition at all of these categories. This is simply a starting point for you to kind of move forward from. So what are some general characteristics of effective interventions that we see? We definitely see that they're highly structured. The more structured the intervention, the greater the tendency it is for our students to enjoy those types of interventions. Also, that they're tailored to the interests of the child. Again, while I said that I would recommend really thinking about what your child's interests and strengths are. Also, trained professionals. Unfortunately, there are professionals out there that say, oh yes, I completely and totally know about autism. I had that in a college class once. Just making sure that they really are trained in understanding what these evidence-based practices are, so that they can give you credible and reliable recommendations and intervention strategies. Also, making sure that those strategies that we use are consistent and coordinated. Sometimes our teams of individuals and interventionists can get so large that it becomes really difficult for us to communicate, well, this is what the speech and language pathologist is working on, and this is what the occupational therapist is working on. So really streamlining and keeping those lines of communication open so that everybody has a coordinated effort and is moving towards the same goal. And hopefully by using a variety of different strategies, but coming around to teach those same types of skills, that at least everyone can be consistent in their implementation of what they're teaching and how that's being taught. It's also important for some of these interventions to be flexible. It's important, obviously, to have them be routine, yes, but at some point in time you need to take a step back and say, the way that we're doing this is not working, so maybe we should tweak it a little bit in this particular aspect or way. So keeping in mind that, yes, it's important for it to be structured, but it also needs to be flexible to consider the needs of the child or the professionals interacting with that child, including yourselves as parents. And also making sure that they're positive interventions. There's so much negativity in the world already that your child does not need any more stressor in their life, and nor do you. So making sure that the interventions that you choose are going to be positive aspects. Now that doesn't mean that it's always going to be hearts and flowers when it comes to teaching them new skills, because many times they don't want to learn a new skill. The way that they've been doing things have been working just fine for them. And so stepping out of their comfort zone to learn something new in a new or different way is not always fun. But overall, making sure that there is an equal amount of fun as there is in work, or even more fun than there is in work, so that they associate the intervention with a positive aspect, that it's not when that provider shows up at the door that your child's going to drop to the floor and be screaming because they see that person in a negative light. So making sure that positive relationships are established. So when we're talking about exploring different treatment options, these are some just different questions that you might ask yourself. Again, is this intervention doable for our family? Sometimes there's great interventions that are available to us, but the doability of that really decreases the likelihood that we're going to be able to follow through with some of the intervention strategies that would be recommended. So just keeping that in the back of your mind is what's going to be doable for us, and let's make sure that, instead of choosing 8 different strategies or 8 different types of therapies, that maybe we just hone in and focus on 1 or 2 in the very beginning so that we can do it and do it well. Also, what is the cost, if any, to the parent? Many insurance companies cover a lot of intervention services, but then again, there's a lot of changes that are going on in the medical world with insurance, and so sometimes recognizing, what's going to be a covered charge and what's not going to be a covered charge, so that I can also find a balance of what is doable financially for our family as well. Sometimes asking yourself, how successful has the program or the intervention been with others? Again, individuals are completely different, and what resource might benefit one child may not be a benefit to another child, because they're all different. But I do think that it's important to talk to other families to see what their experiences have been, so that you can kind of judge, what similarities and differences do our children have, and do I feel like that my child's levels of strengths and weaknesses align with the child's parent that I'm actually talking to see if that might be an intervention worth investing some time and experience in. And again, do staff or the family members that will be working with this child, do they have training and experience? Maybe it's that you need to know more about social stories or social narratives. Well, where can I go to find more information about that? So making sure that everybody is adequately trained, and that when you're implementing an intervention, that you're implementing it with what we call fidelity, meaning that that you're implementing that intervention in the way that it was designed to be done. And how are we going to measure progress? And who is going to do this kind of progress monitoring or this measurement? And I think that's really important, because sometimes we get so caught up in the day-to-day living that we think, oh, I've just got to get them to therapy and we're going to go through these motions. But do we ever really take a step back to look at it and say, wow, are we making gains here, or are we not? So there's a variety of different ways that progress could be measured, and not just necessarily having a conversation to say, oh, he did good or he struggled today in our sessions, but really looking at what types of skills are they acquiring and being able to practice and learn and use independently. And if we're not making that progress, then what do we need to do differently? How do we need to structure this differently so that the child is going to show benefit or gain? And then lastly there, the last bullet is, will the treatment help me at home and at school and in the community? And if you cannot answer yes to those questions or in those environments, then I would caution you to really think more in depth about, is this intervention worth the time? Because if they're not going to learn those skills, then I'm not sure that needs to be the area of focus that you go with. And it may be that later on you may need some more focus on the community, but right now we're just going to look at the treatment being focused at home and at school. How is that going to work? So just food for thought there to be thinking about. And you've heard me use the term today, evidence-based practice. And you say, well, what does that mean? That means that there's multiple high-quality research studies that have been conducted that support that particular use. And you say, well, why is that important? Well, we want to make sure that we have the sharpest tools in our toolbox, because if we're not using intervention strategies that the research has proven to be effective, then they may or may not be effective for our students, but at least it's a good jumping off point to look at. And then also I'm going to give you another resource here in a minute about looking at what's the rationale for selecting that particular intervention. How do I decide if that's important or if that intervention is going to work for that particular purpose? And then also we can avoid the pitfalls of the fad interventions. We have you see all the time, if you're on Facebook or other social networking sites, these advertisements of, we can teach your kid to read in less than 30 days even though they have dyslexia. And I'm not saying that some of those programs don't have the capability of doing that, but sometimes they make those advertisements on there and it kind of gets your attention and it gets you involved, but you really sometimes don't look at the research. Well, how long has this been researched before they actually put this on the market, and what types of supports do they have to say that this intervention specifically works for them? So I would encourage you to go back to that National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders website, and they have now identified 27 evidence-based practices, and if you want to research more, it will give you the specific research articles that were listed in comprising to show that that particular intervention is research-based, and you can even dig up the specific research articles based on their bibliography page. So they have what's called an evidence-based practice brief for each individual evidence-based practice of those 27 that they have listed. So if you click on this website that I've provided with you, it should take you directly to the page where it lists out the evidence-based practice, in which you can click on each individual practice and see the research and a brief summary of what that particular intervention strategy is supposed to address and how that's supported. And then earlier I talked to you about the Autism Internet modules, that free website that you can log on to get more information and watch as many modules as you would like on a particular evidence-based strategies, evidence-based practice. And they have listed their interventions there in line with the National Professional Development Center's 27 evidence-based practices as well. So those are both good, reliable sources. So these are the 27 evidence-based practices, and I wanted to include those for you. One thing that I would like to point out, because many things that you might hear when you have conversations with other parents of children that have been diagnosed, you hear about applied behavior analysis. And one of the questions that we get so often at the center is, why is applied behavior analysis not listed on the 27 evidence-based practices page? And to be honest with you, applied behavior analysis is not a thing. It's a thought process or theory, if you will. So there are many different strategies that fall under that umbrella or that theory in which some people think of as, like I said, applied behavior analysis. It's not a thing, it's a theory. So if you look through this list of interventions, you will see that many of these 27 evidence-based practices actually fall under that umbrella of applied behavior analysis. So things such as antecedent-based interventions, differential reinforcement, discrete trial teaching, extinction, functional behavioral assessment. I mean, as you can see, just in the first few there, those are all included. Prompting, reinforcement, self-management, all of these things can fall under that big umbrella in general. So I just wanted to make sure and call attention to the fact that these are evidence-based practices. These are individual concepts or ideas that fall under that larger umbrella of applied behavior analysis. This is a chart, and forgive me, I know it's a little bit blurry, but if you use that link that I gave you on the on the Professional Development Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders link, you will be able to locate a report in which this chart is included. And what this is a matrix of evidence-based practices. And as you can see over here on the left side, these are the evidence-based practices of the previous list, this one that I just gave you. So ABI stands for antecedent-based interventions. This would be cognitive-based interventions. This would be direct reinforcement, discrete trial training, etc. And what they've done is they've divided those domains, so like teaching social skills, for example, communication skills, focusing on behavior. They've divided these into domains. And then these areas right here are actually the age ranges for each of these domains. So this particular column or category looks at ages 0 to 5. This is ages 6 to 14, and this is ages 15 to 22. So what you would do is you would say, well, my son is 7 years old and I really want to teach him social skills. So which of these evidence-based practices support the use of teaching social skills for a child that would be 7 years of age? So I can look down, and anywhere that there's a colored box, these would be the intervention strategies that I can choose from. Now, as you can see, exercise, for example, is not listed as being evidence-based for this particular age range. That doesn't mean that exercise is not beneficial to that child. It just means that the research that they utilized in order to say that these are evidence-based practices did not specifically reference that evidence-based practice for that specific age. So you could also see that things like academics over here, you know, what are some things for academics that would be helpful for my child that, again, is 7 years of age? Well, antecedent-based interventions, discrete trial training, functional communication training, functional behavioral assessments, those would all be those evidence-based practices. So I see one of the questions that had popped up is, how do you choose or tailor an intervention that builds on your child's interests when their obsessive focus is on one specific interest that might be restrictive? So figure out how, which one of these, like let's say that you want to teach them social skills. And so if they have an extensive focus on Minecraft or Mario, thinking about how can I organize their environment, for example, to tailor these social skills or teach them those social skills. So maybe it's that under cognitive behavioral intervention, if you want to teach them about personal space, you can say, hey, you know, Mario has to learn about personal space when he interacts with Luigi. So Mario might, you know, make sure that he stands this far away from an individual or from Luigi when he's talking to you. So I hope that answers that question of how can you take that specific interest and tailor that in more specifically to their area of need. And then the other thing I was going to talk about is coping strategies for parents. And why is this so important? It's very easy to become overwhelmed with all of the information that's coming at you at once. And many times when I talk with parents and work with parents, they say, well, I kind of knew that something was different, but I just wasn't ready for that autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, you know, when I left that doctor's office that day. And so it's very overwhelming, and there's a ton of things to process through. I always say that it's, you know, a grieving process in and of itself, because the child that you thought you were going to raise is not the child that they're telling you that you are now interacting with, and what you thought you would be teaching them on a daily basis is now having to be taught in a different format or a different way, and you might be having to access those outside providers, which is difficult. So these are just some things to kind of keep in the back of your mind as you go through, because self-care is so critically important for parents. And I think that sometimes we are so guilty of throwing ourselves at our kids and all of their needs that we don't take the time that we need to take a step back and take care of ourselves. And if I've learned anything in my personal life, even as well as my professional life, is that if we can't take care of ourselves, then we are not going to be able to help others in a proficient way. So definitely taking time for yourself. First of all, I think that you guys have already done this by participating in this webinar, but you're taking action, you're being involved, and you're educating yourself about what options and choices are out there and interventions for your particular child. Also, I would encourage you to appreciate the small things. Sometimes in life, especially as we go through, the small things are really the important things, but we don't take the time to really think about and appreciate those things, whether it be that our child has difficulty with eating and today they licked a bite of a new food that they never would have been able to tolerate before. That's a huge accomplishment. That's a baby step in the right direction on getting them to be more functional in their eating habits and independent. So sometimes really taking a step back to say, what are 3 positive things that happened today? And that's really difficult for all of us to do sometimes in our adult lives and the way that things are and stressors that we might have in our environment. But I think it's really important for us to do that when we're interacting with our children, because sometimes it's those small things that get us through and that get them to acquire a larger skill. So really celebrating those things are important. Something else that I would always say, and I kind of led into this, is what we call positive affirmations. So telling yourself in your head, you know, today might have been a rough day, but we still walked away with blank. So one of the things that I did with many of the families that I worked with is we would have what's called a positive affirmation jar when we left their house. So as a provider, when I worked in mental health, it was just a glass jar that we kept on the countertop, and we would just jot down on a Post-it note or a scrap piece of paper one positive thing that happened today during our session. So it might be that he made eye contact with me for longer than 3 seconds, or we found a new area of interest. He really enjoyed Minecraft today and he's never really stopped to think about that before. Or maybe I found a new reinforcer that the kid really, really liked. He loved to be spun around in a circle, or there's a specific song that we found that he really engaged in today and enjoyed. So anything like that, any little thing that happened, he was able to pull his pants down independently when we tried to work on toileting today. Those are all small things to celebrate. And so what we would do is we would throw those positive affirmations in the jar, and if we had had a really bad day, then on our way out, maybe there were some days that we couldn't put something in, but we needed to take something out. So we would go and just grab something randomly, and maybe it would be a memory of something that we had placed in the jar, or maybe that it was something that someone else had experienced. But those little things in life are the way that we kind of get through. And I find that if you can kind of take a positive spin on things and keep that positive focus. And it's not always going to happen, I know that. But really trying to keep that positive momentum forward, then that really seems to drive your team in a positive direction as well as yourself. Also remember your family. Sometimes I think that it's really difficult to remember that you might have other children that have needs as well, and that they are affected by your child's diagnosis or difficulties that they might be having in the setting. So remembering that, you know, big sister might be a really crucial person in order to help you teach a skill that you're struggling to teach. Or maybe it's that big sister is having a really hard time seeing how, you know, emotionally spent you are because you've had such a bad week in dealing with behaviors. You know, she might have lived that with you. So making sure that we're including that family component, as well as that extended family. You know, many times grandparents say, I just feel helpless. I don't know what to do to help, so therefore I just don't say anything. So sometimes that might come across as being non-supportive when it's really just not knowing exactly what they can do to be supportive to that family structure. So remembering that they have questions and concerns and they want to be supportive as much as possible, usually they just don't know what to do in order to help. And I've already preached this, but self-care, making sure that you have some time, even if it's just 5 minutes of your day, to go in the bathroom and shut the door and just kind of reflect and listen to music on your own or have a shower or something like that, even if it's just a few minutes to kind of take some time for yourself to think about all the things that I've mentioned previously. I always say keep a sense of humor. And I think that's important because there are funny things that happen in our life. And so many of us deal with crazy and stressful situations by thinking about the humor in it, because we all have those issues where you look back and you're like, you know what, that day was just comical, and had I been an outside person looking in, I couldn't do nothing but laugh. And I can laugh about the situation because I lived through it, but I think it's important for us to kind of celebrate those things and you know, and keep a light sense of humor as well, because it kind of gets us through those troubling times. And then also find a support group. That doesn't have to be a formal support group meeting that you attend in your community, but when I say a support group, I mean a network of friends or family or church members or Boys and Girls Club staff if your child goes to the Boys and Girls Club, or the YMCA, just some group of support that you can either talk with them about you know, your child and some of the trials and tribulations. There are also Facebook groups. I know now that many parents have found some solace in terms of finding other parents that deal with some of the same issues that they do. So just reach out and have some kind of support group network so that you're not on this island all by yourself. So that would conclude the formal presentation that I've developed for today, but if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer those at this time. Again, if you'll remember, there's a question box that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. So please feel free to type those questions, and I will address those as they come up. I'm not seeing any questions, but as always, you can feel free to contact us. These are the 3 field training coordinators that are out in the field, myself, Laura Ferguson, and Kim Howard. And then we also have other professionals at the center that you see their contact information on the left-hand side that you would be able to have contact with at any time had you have other questions.
Michelle, thank you so much for providing us with such valuable information today. And I'd like to thank everybody else for attending today's webinar. This webinar was recorded and will be added to our YouTube channel, where you can find over 70 webinars available about different aspects of autism. The handouts are on the side panel of your control box. You can download those. They were also emailed out earlier today. And thanks again for attending today's webinar.